This is my beloved Jeff Taylor. This is his workshop. I am his Vanna White. If that offends you, Ken Kaiser upped it. Remember Ken Kaiser? He makes everything better.
There's Ken.
He said you are Vanna the Steadfast. Oh, you will hear from me 3 times. This is the first. Again at the break, which you will probably well need about halfway in, and then perhaps to close us out at the end. You heard the peal of the bell chiming. Jesus taught the appeal to the emotions as the technique of arresting and focusing the intellectual attention.
And we're going to talk about what triggers those emotional responses. What the peptides and neurotransmitters are that control those and processes, epigenetics and other mechanisms to control the controllers of those processes. Anyways, this is on my phone. I need to switch over to the laptop. So I want to look at the picture first. This is what's going on in my head. Separated into those 5 frequency ranges. In each of those frequency ranges is a hugely complex pattern. This is sort of the average in those. And it's starting out in the low frequency and high frequency. And you can see, as I'm thinking, things are dancing around. I'm just going to briefly go into a kind of a meditative state, and I hope that I'm relaxed enough that they will calm down. Anyway, it may or may not have happened, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
There's electrical activity going on in your mind, in your brain, which, and we'll differentiate mind in a moment. But your brain is the tangible part of your body. Your mind is more the intangible pattern of that brain activity. You don't have control over mind, but you have control over his brain. You don't even have control of the brain. You have control of the sensory input and reaction to the output of brain. We're going to talk about some of those mechanisms, some of those functions, and we're going to try and do it in a purely physiological or physics. The spiritual part you have to do on your own. I'm going to tell you about the physics that you have control over, and some of the mechanisms that you can be aware of, so that when you are doing the spiritual things, you realize that it's those sincerity in decisions, consistency, and what's the word Brad used? Vigilance of those activities that pattern the brain, which buy you those levels of consciousness. So we're going to look at the different states of consciousness. And when we think of consciousness, the medical community has 2 states. You're either awake or unconscious. And the anesthetist is trying to control that level of unconsciousness. But basically what they're doing is they're messing with your brain stem. They're messing with the bits that takes the sensory input and passes it up. So these are the different. Can you enlarge that one for me?
Will this be available?
Yes. Yes.
There's a link in the.
There's a what?
There's a link in the program.
Oh yeah, to download it. You're more than welcome to do that.
We're working on it. It's great.
Okay.
Very simple. It's like my wife.
It doesn't seem to want to enlarge. I can try and do the projected value.
So much for
Anyway, you, you can go to the link to get the pretty pictures at any time. But basically, we've got these 8 states of the brain, and I've added the one from the Ranch book, which is super consciousness. That's not a medical normal term, but we got unconsciousness. That's the sort of anesthetically induced state of the brain, and we disrupted the connectivity to the brain. The brain's still there, it's still functioning, but you just don't know. Then there's subconscious. This is suppressed brainstem. Brainstem at the back, that's the reptilian portion of your brain. You're not really aware of that, but it's the automatic functioning of your thinking process, your breathing, your heart, and the unconscious thinking, the things you don't have to think about thinking, they just happen. And then there's deep sleep. This is a state of sleep where your delta waves or the slow frequency waves are dominant. It's also a state where your immune system is repairing itself, the body's repairing itself, and there's any cellular fixing in the brain has got to be done in that deep sleep where you're not confusing with anything else. This is an interesting little thing in hypnagogia. You know, in that stage of sleep where you just kind of fall off between wakefulness and true sleep, that's called hypnagogia. And it's a particularly creative portion, and we'll get to some reasons why later on. Then there's actual quiet sleep, and that's the hypothalamus shutdown. So the brainstem, there's a portion of the brainstem that turns itself off. So you're no longer really aware of what's going on outside. You're aware, for other things internally. And when you get into deep sleep, or when you get into REM sleep, you dream. So rapid eye movement sleep is your dreaming state. There's an interesting thing that happens in REM sleep is your thermostat goes wrong, turns itself off. Every system has to have a shutdown mode for repair. So they sort of take different stages in sleep or consciousness to say, all right, I'm off duty, I can fix myself now. I'm on duty, I've got to repair. So in each of these states, some of the other states take over. Then there's the Urantia book definition of superconsciousness. I define superconsciousness as those pathways which are predefined in your brain. The kinds of thinking that you've thought, I always think this way. Think of it as like an accent. You meet someone from Britain, they got a British accent, right? They don't think about their British accent, they just have a British accent. Well, you have a way of thinking. Those ways of thinking are electrical pathways in the brain that are formed. They're troughs. And the more entrenched you are in those troughs, the more the walls or the electrical voltage walls force you to stay in those troughs. And I'm going to talk about how those troughs are formed and some of the ways of getting out of that trough. And in fact, there's an interesting, whoa, anyways.
Turned off.
Yeah.
Seems like you're alone.
It's I mean, I do that periodically, like we said it to not go to sleep. All right, so we're gonna look at some of the physiology of consciousness, and one of the interesting things is that all those different 8 states of consciousness, there is one thing that stays online all the time, and that's the gut. Your intestines are working all the time; they don't take a break. They just. So you've got this this intercommunication ability in the enteric nervous system, which is functioning all the time. So the cells of our body communicate with each other directly through to the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, so 1.8 meters long. And if you think about the body as going from acid in the stomach to alkaline in the intestine, it's just like charging the battery. that builds up an electrical charge. If you think about the mitochondria, there's 12 different steps in the mitochondria that are an electron transport chain that takes that glucose energy and turns it into electrical energy, because electrical energy is what powers you. Every cell movement, every time there's movement of any cell in the body, it's electrically driven. It's positive, negative charges, either repelling or attracting, that makes the proteins walk or the enzymes or the things that move or jiggle. And I want you to think about the overall frequencies. At the very mechanical end, we have things in the 1 hertz or lower range, right? That's where you move and where Brownian motion is. So molecules are just sitting and jiggling. Then you have the high frequency, the megahertz range. That's where the bonds, like the oxygen, hydrogen, and water bonds, the oxygen and hydrogen are doing this and doing that. That's in the infrared range. That's the heat range. Okay, so we have heat, we have mechanical, we have heat. And then you get a little higher frequency. That's when the electrons are jumping up and down in the individual molecules. That's a higher frequency. That's up in the ultraviolet frequency. And then if you think there's even higher frequencies, that's probably getting into the spiritual frequencies. But I think that it's a spiritual continuum. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. So anyway, our cells communicate with each other directly by these hydrophilic and hydrophobic or electrically attractive or repelling mechanisms. That's how things move around. If you think about the eye itself, incoming photons hit little pancakes, stacks of pancakes in the rods and cones of the eye. Incoming photon triggers a molecule, releases a little tiny peptide, which triggers the next molecule, which makes an electrical signal, which goes to the visual cortex of the brain. So that happens in multiple of these pancakes. Those all go as electrical signals to the brain. You then picture that, recreate a picture from those electrical signals in the brain. But it's not just the photon-triggered peptides moving around in your rods and cones that give you the image. It's everything that's going on in your brain that gives you the image. And you as the reentry book says, there's 15 million chemical reactions going any one time in the numerous ductless glands. And the same peptides that do the visual cortex are involved in all of your responses, all of your emotional responses, all of your physiological responses. So we're going to talk about peptides a little bit. Peptides are parts of proteins. Where you get protein? Well, you eat protein, right? But you also manufacture proteins. Peptides are pieces of acids, which are parts of bigger proteins. And we'll talk about how they're folded and how they're managed in the system. But these peptide-based chemical reactions, when they do the nerve from the optic nerve getting from the rods and the cones, those are triggered along nerve cells. We'll talk about how those nerve cells function a little bit later. But the critical first stop of all these things, whether it's touching a finger or seeing a bird, comes to the brain stem, to the amygdala, to the various areas of the brain. I had them listed here. I can't remember what they are. Anyway, so think about those photons that come in. The pancakes have little jiggling molecules in them. So it's all of your cells are sort of jiggling in that Brownian motion, low frequency response. And you got about 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses in the brain to deal with those incoming signals. But as I said, the image is not so much electrical impulses as your interpretation of those electrical impulses. Nobody can really define what red is. You just know that people call that whatever it is you see red. Same thing here. You interpret that as either a duck looking one way or a rabbit looking the other, you know? And you can switch back and forth to say, oh yeah, I see that. Oh yeah, I see that. But it's all your interpretation of what you're seeing. And so from a ranch book's perspective, all you do is discover, recognize, interpret, and choose. So you're getting those electrical stimulus. And this is sort of a pretty picture of all the chaos that's going on in your mind. For every input that comes into this brain stem or the midbrain, there are 10 going out from it. So the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the pineal, and pituitary glands are all making decisions. What are we going to do with this input? We've got this sensory input. What do we do with it? Oh, let's send it off to the frontal cortex. So this is decision-making stuff. Or, oh, no, this is normal. Just keep the heart beating, you know? So that reptilian brain is just making those kinds of decisions. And there's a lot more going to the visual cortex because they were getting a lot of visual information constantly. There's basically two mechanisms. The cytoskeletal structures, the eicosanoids, and the eicosanoids are mostly involved with the immune system. So we're not going to talk too much about them because it sort of takes care of itself. We're going to focus in on the cytoskeletal structures for intercommunication, cellular communication, and on nerve cells. So let's look at nerve cells themselves first. In the nerve cell, you've got the trigger comes in to one end, and it cascades, it turns the incoming signal into an electrical signal, and that electrical signal along these nerves, which I said went to the longest nerve, which is the vagus nerve, up to a meter. Like, I got misquoted. It's only a meter, the vagus nerve. So very small, very short lengths or long lengths, but you take the incoming signal and you fire the electrical signal along to the far end. And at the far end, there are these little synapses, the connections from one nerve to another. And right in the ends of these synaptic terminals are little packages of neurotransmitters. Remember those peptides we talked about earlier? They hide in here. And there's a bunch of them hiding in there. And you get to choose what kind of peptides typically reside in those, because you're either excitable or you're calm. You're either going around with your eyebrows down and angry all the time, or your cheeks are up and you're smiling all the time. So that pre-existence determines those functions, or what's resident or normally functioning in those things. And the brain is very sensitive to pattern. Stop everyone. There's a pattern. There's a diurnal pattern, and there are other patterns. But the brain is looking for the path of least resistance. We're basically lazy animals. And the brain is lazy. It's going to take the easiest path of electrical flow. So if you've thought that kind of thing before, it's going to take that as a preferred path. And when you're young, up to age 25, you're much more open to finding those paths, right? But after about 25, those paths are set. You are who you're going to behave like. You can change those things, but it's a lot more difficult. You only got 500, 700 new neurons a day to play with. And at our age, we're probably losing more than we're gaining. So, but you can modify that, and by your decisions and your sincerity and your repetitions, you can influence that. One of the ways you influence those is with this epigenetics. Epigenetics is a really interesting mechanism. We all know what genetics is. It's your gene, right? But the gene is in every cell of your body. And some of your cells behave like gallbladders, and some of them behave like brain cells. What determines whether that DNA makes a brain cell or a gallbladder is the way it's folded. And what controls the way it's folded are things called enhancers. So there's little sections of the gene that say, well, I'd rather meet with that guy, right? Because their plus, minus, negative charges match, right? So these enhancers determine the way the protein folds. And that determines whether it ends up being a gallbladder or a brain cell. You can influence that by tagging that folding. So the next time that cell is manufactured, it will manufacture itself slightly differently. Epigenetic tagging, epi above and tagging. So they put this little methyl group on one of the enhancers that changes the way the protein folds, where the DNA causes the protein to fold, and that determines what it's going to become. There's 4,000 completely unique enhancers in humans. So the light carrier is really, we're finessing the details here. In the DNA, which is probably what the life carrier is implanted in 7 warm seas, they had the ability to have these enhancers. So humans have 4,000 little segments of genes that influence the way things fold, that are unique to us. These are just some of the ways that you can do this epigenetic modification, and I won't go into the details. They're fairly technical. Feel free to spend as much time as you like reading this thing, and an open email. We can start up a conversation, a group discussion on evolving this. This is going to evolve for years because we're really just sort of scraping the tip of this iceberg. So epigenetic modifications involve the release of neurotransmitters. They change the way you can change the way you react to them, whether it's a knee-jerk reaction. And think about an animal response. The animal just does. He doesn't think about what he's going to do. He just does it. So, but we have the ability to bias time, and I'll talk about those time mechanisms. But what we're influencing in those in that time between sensory input and response are these neurotransmitters. Serotonin, 95% comes from the gut. So you've got a neurotransmitter primarily at the intercellular communication level. You've got things like dopamine. Well, everybody knows dopamine, right? Dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. Motivation, pleasure, happiness. And an interesting thing about dopamine is that it plateaus. It becomes, if you eat a lot of sugar, you have this, the pleasure trap, where that level of sugar becomes the norm. And you don't get the dopamine response until you go to a higher level of dopamine. And, putting all sugars lowers the pleasure trap response. So even a small amount of sugar gives you the dopamine response. Why is ice cream so pleasurable? Because it's cold and you don't taste the sickly sweet, but you get the sugar. So, you wouldn't eat ice cream, if it was the stirred up caramel chocolate, fat cream in warmed up soup, right? But cold, you get the same glucose hit, and it says, "Whoa, that's good. Let's have some more of that."
He knows whereof he's speaking.
Anyway, some of the other neurotransmitters. This is a very interesting one. This glutamate gamma balance controls our excitement versus our urge to be calm. This is one of the things that changes dramatically in that childhood to adolescent phase. We're trying to trigger, we're trying to figure out who we are, what we want to be. And this glutamate GABA balance changes dramatically in those age groups. Some of the other ones, oxytocin, endorphins, the current pleasure, self-esteem. This is an interesting one, neurotensin. It's like dopamine, but it's specifically, is that good or bad? And in the old days, when you were trying to look at a plant and determine whether it's edible or an animal, whether it's going to eat you or not, it was the one who was involved in those kinds of decisions. But probably now, is more involved in our spiritual choices. Is this good for me in an eternal sense or not? One of the ways these neurotransmitters move through cells is the cell walls are specifically shaped to accommodate this weird shaped neurotransmitter to come in or go out of the cell. It's an amazingly complex system. And what's its one goal? Homeostasis. It wants everything to be calm and safe. And we do our best to make it anything but. There's lots of quotes in the Ranch book to talk about the poisons of anxiety and the physical poisons that retard the thought adjuster communication. So really our emotional conditions relate to our calmness, which in turn relates to our trust. If we have trust in God and the plan, we can be calm. If we're not sure he's up to good, we're a little nervous, right? If we're in the material world and we're worried about everything, we obviously don't trust God's plan, because if it wasn't God's plan, it wouldn't be happening anyway. So if we don't have that calmness, then we give over to the animal response mechanisms. One of the things I want to talk about is the superconsciousness. And this guy, Benjamin Libet, discovered that there's about 300 milliseconds, or a third of a second, between you being aware of your thought and the thought actually being a thought.
Say that again.
Stuff is going on in your mind right now. When I'm talking, you're thinking. But before you're really aware of that thought, your brain's putting the pieces together. So it's actively collating all of the things that have to do with all the things in your mind, in your brain, that have to do with what I'm talking about. So that's busy forming itself and collecting itself as a thought. That formation process happens a good third of a second before you're even aware of what you're thinking. So this is where the thought adjuster probably has more control, because it's the way you have couched everything. It's the way you think without thinking. You know you're going to react that way. Your brain knows you're going to react that way. It's pre-wired for that kind of activity. So you got about a third of a second to be aware of that influence before you think it. And this is just one neuron firing. And remember that 86 billion neurons? They're all doing this. Anyway, we talked a little bit, we talked a little bit about the GABA balance. The Rancher book has that same mentality, talks about up to the age of 20 years, where it goes from thought changer to thought adjuster. And if you look at the physiology that's changing up to that same time age bracket, it's that GABA balance, it's the electrical pathways. There's a very interesting thing going on in the myelin sheath. Remember that picture of the nerves at the beginning and those little trumpets or those little tubes that were on the outside? Those are 8 proteins, 8 different types of proteins that coat the nerve. They're not there when you're born. They're not there when you're young. They're there to make the thinking more speedy and more direct. When you're young and trying to figure out, you see the baby laying there trying to, oh, look, oh, that, yes, wow, look at that, oh, my gosh. They're figuring out what the brain, how the brain relates to their physical, and they're making those pathways. Musician, the muscle memory, that's coating with myelin, those nerves that need to be quick, and they need to be just that one. Don't worry about all those others. Okay? And that's fine if you want to be single-minded, if you want to be not aware of what else is going on. It happens primarily up to age 21, 25, that those myelin sheaths get thicker and thicker and make your thinking much more quick, but much less involved or much less interpreted by the cross-pollination of your thoughts. So if we're going to be aware of the cross-pollination, in other words, we're going to be aware of what the thought adjuster is trying to make you think, you don't want to be thinking what you're always thinking. You want to be open to those cross-pollinated thoughts. So you have to be aware that if you continue to think the way you're thinking, you will only think the way you're thinking. And we'll talk a little bit about processes to do that. There's a really interesting thing that those triggers along those sections of nerves happens at about 5 to 50 times a second, which equates to 200 to 300 hertz, which is right in the musical D to G range. So when you're listening to that beautiful cello music, it's probably stimulating that calming influence on your nerves. And those frequencies you saw on the pictures of the electroencephalogram, this is just the second one down, and it's already extremely complex and confusing. It doesn't, it's more chaotic than anything else. And at each stage, there's lower frequencies. This is beta, alpha, theta, and delta. These are the lower frequency ones, but even at the low frequency range, it's still fairly complex. One of the interesting things in this thought changer, thought adjuster variation is that kids think or have more dominant delta wave. When we age, we move up in the frequencies. When you're worshiping, you're down in the delta wave. When you're deep sleep, you're down in the delta wave. So think about the thought changer in the delta wave dominant phase and worship as a delta wave dominant phase. They're open to external input, thought changer. We can be open to that same change mentality if we can calm this cacophony of noise in the jangly upper frequencies.
Jeff, if I may interrupt and you may take a drink of water. It makes me think of in worship where we're asked to go, how we're asked to be, except to be as a child. And when we're worshiping, we're approaching our Father as a child, as a loving Father. So it just makes so much sense that worship brings us back to that childlike state. And when we're communing.
So there's too many distractions, staying over here, when everybody, when you have their attention.
Yeah. Don't want to distract Jeff, and it's good he can tweak right now, just take a little break this way. Many of these things that you're hearing perhaps for the first time in Speedily, there's these little highlights that Jeff and I over coffee or over a walk or over just, it doesn't go away. We don't breeze through it. And it's like this delta state, this calm state, effortless attention, worship is called effortless attention. So finding yourself in that state as you approach God, as spiritual communion with God our Father to worship, brings us into this more childlike way, this humble, this adoring our Father. And it makes just good sense, doesn't it? Thank you, Mike.
Oh, thank you. So anyway, this is what we're trying to quiet, this confusing mass of electrical activity. And this is just a few locations on the brain and just a few neurons, and we've got 100 trillion of them. So as we can calm them down, we get into more rhythmic. This is a very interesting pattern here, because when we talk about something later on, the 4 hertz that's happening, if you filter that all out, there's 4 hertz buried in there. Not quite 4 hertz, but for you it's your frequency, and for me it's my frequency. It's somewhere in that 3 to 3.75 hertz range. We might be using that as a time clock. We'll talk about the necessity of having a time clock a bit later. These brain waves, if we analyze the stuff that's coming in on the Muse, and you can see on those original pictures, those higher frequencies are involved in intellectual activity, with your thinking, right? The beta waves, the next one down, is in your executive functioning. So I'm moving, I'm doing, I've made the decisions and I'm acting on it. Alpha wave is more in the, I'm gonna relax and think about this for a bit. So it's calm thinking. Theta waves, the next one down, is light meditation and sleep. And delta, deep meditation and worship. So that's one of your goals, is to be childlike and be calm and be confident in God's plan. Those voltage variations, those little wiggles on the line, are 30 microvolts over a base voltage of 70 millivolts. So you're talking about sort of a base level of activity and then a little tiny jiggle over top of that, which determines everything you think. So there's massive cross communication, and our goal as a maturing individual is to get rid of the noise and just figure out the way we want to think. But this is where they sort of say childlike mind, and they may be talking about those calm frequencies. The trust the child has in the parent, we now have to have in our parent, and be calm. I talked about the white matter, that envelops those nerves to make the thinking process more direct and quick. It defines the preferred voltage pathways and the voltages which are required to get out of the rut. So you spent 50 years thinking that way. It's going to take a few years to get it to be different. You're sure about what you think, so it takes a lot more to get out of the ways you think, and that also involves emotions and socialized thoughts, which are very much involved in peer pressure when you're a young person growing up. Not so much involved with peer pressure as we age. This is an interesting slide. It shows the green neurons growing into an old neural path. So we can do it. We can change the way we think. It just takes time and persistence and consistency.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was taught and learned from trainings that behavior is usually can be changed over a period of about 3 weeks, and you continually do this. So why did it take so much longer for these thoughts versus behavior?
Well, it took the person however many years to get where they are. They can change some things in 3 weeks. Some things take longer. If you, I think there are some things that are more malleable. Some peptides, some neurotransmitters are more malleable. You can convince yourself, well, I'm not going to get angry every time. I'm going to calm down. I'm not going to let it influence me that way. And you can sort of override it with emotional responses or with responses. But to correct the initial reaction is different. So it may be in the first 3 weeks you can say, oh, calm down. But it takes a lot longer to not go in the first place.
Also, was a 21-day challenge I gave us to think positive, that 3 week.
Yeah.
Oh, you're responsible for that.
No. So I'm sorry to get you off, but I was just curious about it.
Jeff, we have one more question in the back.
Okay, a comment. The brain is material,
right? So once that channel, that pathway is established, you can't undo it because it's made up of atoms.
Right.
So you have to reform a whole new one to really change that behavior.
Yeah, you have to make the new path more desirable than the old path. You can't really make that old path go away. You just have to make the new path so more desirable or more electrically.
Or even a
Biased.
deviation from the old path. Maybe you start down that old path and then you change something.
You short circuit the old path.
For a few weeks, I've been trying something new and I've been feeling good about it. I had some stress with getting ready for the conference and that, and transportation and everything. And I catch myself more often thinking, okay, this is my thought. I have an infinity of choices of how to react. How do I choose to react? And then I started looking at my choices and thinking, no, I imagine the thought as something outside of me, like a fire hydrant or a rainbow or something like that. And then, what is my choice? Like, if I choose to do that. So
Well, we're
to
gonna
be
talk
able
about
to
things that change those thought choices, but we want to keep it on physics. We don't want to get into too far away from that. This whole the current formation is called your connectome, and it's the current patterning, and it's solidifying up to that age 25 when that glutamate GABA neurotransmitter finds a happy medium. We're forming the preconceived notion, preconceived opinion settled ideas and long-standing prejudices, and putting more water in a full cup becomes a challenge.
Yeah.
There are ways to do that. We're going to look at microtubules, microtubule-assisted proteins, and activity-regulated cytoskeleton peptides, ARC peptides. They're all bits of proteins, and we're going to talk about the function. So let's look about changer, adjuster, controller. This is our job. Why is coordination of material and spiritual forces? And setting up the favorable conditions of loyalty, sincerity, humility, patience as fulcrums. So let's think about how we do that. First, if you're going to put things in order, you got to have a map. Your brain is a big map. The brain stem, the hypothalamus, the pineal, pituitary glands, they just get the signals in. Then they have a map to say, well, where am I going to send this stuff? So the brain is all mapped out with various areas that are functional. The entorhinal cortex is the critical first stop that decides where am I, just go to memory, just go to some action. Does this, and what do I do with this? And to do that, it needs some coherence. It needs to say, well, what's stable, what's stationary, what's fixed that I can relate this incoming thing to. So that's what the entorhinal cortex does. So it's looking for coherence. It's looking for relationships. It's looking to say where this incoming signal belongs. So it needs a cross-reference to time and space. It builds up a picture in your brain of where you are physically, emotionally, intellectually. It builds a map. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how that map is oriented. So it has a grid of cells that fire when we move, either imaginatively or actually, but it's building a map. If you build a map, paradise is where I'm going, this is where I am, you put yourself in that perspective. There's ways of getting a clock reference for the time reference for time and space. One of them is that 4 hertz we talked about in the theta wave. And that comes again from the hippocampal brainstem region of the brain. Another one would be if the EC could reference something outside of time. In other words, if you transfer your material existence to an eternal existence, that's a way of, well, what's outside of time? Well, there's 2 things you have that are outside of time: thought adjuster and personality. right? They're both changing. It could be the stabilizing influence on you or one of those two things.
Jeff,
Sir,
does the brain have a perception of the passage of time when it's unconscious?
yes. You may not be ever aware of that, but personality is aware of time. And you don't lose your personality when you're unconscious. You may not have a physical representation of that time when you're unconscious, when you're
Because
drugged.
when I've awakened patients up from a short surgery, they'll say, well, that didn't take very long.
No, that's right. It may have been an 8-hour surgery. Yeah, they say. They're not aware of the passage of time because you've taken the entorhinal cortex offline, right? But the thought adjuster and well, mostly the personality is aware. So when you wake up the mansion world, you'll be aware of what happened in that period of time because it doesn't lose consciousness, even though the patient does that. But we're getting a little off track there.
But we're good with time, so
Oh, okay,
you're
good.
good, hon.
Did we have time? Did you guys?
But you have a question?
Did we have time?
That's a good question. There are two times of time. Not enough when you're late. Too much when you're early. And I call it, when you're early, all lights are green, and when you're late, all lights are red.
Yeah.
So if you want all lights to be green, be early.
That's what this guy said.
It's called working Murphy. Anyway, one of the things that gives us sensory input, and these things are in between all cells of the body that have a nucleus. So think DNA. All the cells in your body that carry your DNA, and that's not your nails or your hair, so they don't, but all the cells in your body that carry your DNA are connected by these little structural tubes, among other things. And they're called microtubules. And they are 13 heterodimer, or individual but different, columns of tubulins, arranged in parallel with a saltwater cavity in the center. And they're what they call soliton, or self-sustaining electromagnetic fields along each one of the individual 13 filaments. And they're sufficiently insulated from the surroundings to be on their own. They're not short-circuited by the milieu they're in. Okay, so they're separate electrical conduits. And they only happen at a certain animal stage of development. So think adjutant, mind, spirit. You've got these things connecting all the cells of your body that have your DNA that change in length, that cross-communicate, that give you the time between sensory input and sharing that sensory input with a neighboring cell. Up to a half a second when you get your microtubules long and calm. And these are made of those proteins that we talked about earlier, but they're somewhat crystalline-like, and they are bioluminescent. They trigger a bioluminescence, which triggers a neighboring cell, which triggers the bioluminescence, which triggers the neighboring cell, down those 13 filaments, and they cross-pollinate with their neighboring cells in either a resonance or non-resonance, optically, mechanically. And they do that in 4 different frequency ranges. Remember I talked earlier about the low frequency jiggle and the medium frequency mechanical and the infrared heat and the ultraviolet electron jump? This is where it really comes into play, because we've got these tubes, and maybe I'll just flip down to the picture of these things first. This is what they look like. Tubes, individual molecules, sort of a plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, and they're connected by these MAPs, or microtubule assisted proteins, and they look like that.
Wow.
A little confused, but think of them as tubes that go between a cell with a nucleus, there's the mitochondria, to the next cell, and they little microtubules and tubes with hollow. Okay. So now let's go back and look at the frequencies that they intercommunicate at. 0.1 to 0.4 hertz, 10 to 30 megahertz. So they've got a low frequency jiggle and a higher frequency mechanical jiggle. And then all the way up to 200 megahertz. Well, 200 megahertz is still in the 30-foot wavelength. So it's not big jiggle. I mean, it's not a little jiggle, it's a big jiggle. Then we get up to the, this is the inch range of those mechanical. So 1100 inches or 700 inches wavelength. So it's more of a bounce than a frequency. Then you get up into the gigahertz range. This is in the 11 to 6 inch wavelength range. So now you're getting down to something with jiggling in this kind of size wavelength. And they have, that's the radio wave, and they have it at 526 and 686. Those are two very specific frequencies that these little tubules are intercommunicating at, or jiggling each other, or jiggling their neighbor at. Then you get up in the terahertz range, the infrared range, which is the bond stretching range. So now you're talking about very small. I want you to think for a minute in terms of going inward. Because the higher frequencies are smaller. We just went from 10-foot waves to 6-inch waves to molecules jiggling, the oxygen, hydrogen of your water molecules jiggling. That's a very small wavelength. And then we get up into the ultraviolet range. There's two frequencies in the ultraviolet range, 276 and 334 nanometer. These are centimeters in the ultraviolet range. This is where the electrons jump up and down. So think smaller and smaller and smaller as you get up into those higher frequency ranges. But these are very specific frequencies, and each one of those 13 microtubules are cross-communicating. And this whole thing has a name. It's called Orchestrated Objective Reduction, OOR. And it implies, or it states, that this is where our consciousness resides, where our mind resides. And remember, these are happening in all the cells of your body, but you're probably most aware of them in the brainstem, because that's where your thinking happens. But this is going on in the brain stem, in the brain, in the various cortex regions. But this orchestrated objective reduction is like the collapse of the wave function for quantum mechanics or quantum physics. Because you've got all these things cohering at these frequencies, and when they lock, they collapse. What makes them collapse? Probably a spiritual influence. If you're calm, they are more receptive to those, to collapsing that wave function. Anyway, some people call it a qubit. There's some controversy in this whole OR mechanism. They say the body is too hot, messy, noisy to support quantum coherence. But as a spiritual being, you understand that we can be calm, we can be trusting of God, and we can allow this communication mechanism. This is the guy that originally developed this OOR, not OOP, back in the 1990s. And he says a large number of microtubules in the brain each reach the state of quantum coherence, and then the wave collapses. So when your thinking matches, and in this case I'm thinking of supreme, or even that tension between the unqualified absolute and the deity absolute, when it matches that pattern, you're okay, you're happy, you're functioning. You've transcended, Rick. From the Urantia book perspective, true spiritual experience is the experiential realization of cosmic reality, of the observation of all this relativistic synthesis of energy, materials of time and space. We're dealing in the material world. We've now got a map of where we are in the cosmos. We've got structure in the body and the brain that is receptive to lengthening. We can grow these microtubules and shorten them. If we want to shorten the time between input and reaction, these microtubules shorten. We probably are related to the seven agents, and worship and wisdom are probably, when they get to a certain length, they become more involved in the wisdom because you've got more time to react. Do we need to take a break?
This is the time when we thought we would, it is 11 o'clock, so we're at the 45 minutes-ish of 2 hours. Time for Q&A, and then just a short break to catch your breath, jiggle out, so they're gonna stay awake for part two. The part two is all the application, the continuation of the application of this. So, but this is when we said that we could block out about 10 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
And here it is all over the place.
So would it be fair to say, in comparison, because let's hear that there's pre-consciousness of the consciousness
Yes.
to be conscious.
Yes, there is. Your brain's got all your thoughts sorted out for you before you even think it.
So my question is,
You're focusing.
if we have mind and we have consciousness,
Mhm.
and we are the supreme being, takes cumulative, all our minds become part of its mind. Is it fair to say it's the same way that the cells of our body may have a mind of their own, and then we are their supreme being,
Yes.
and they're cumulatively feeding us as supreme being,
Yeah.
and then on and on and on, like
Yeah.
fractals.
That's a good way of thinking. But every cell in your body has a mind of its own.
And I'm saying that it's thinking before we even get it.
You got it.
It's already accumulating before we get to floor.
Yeah.
So they must be thinking and saying, gather all the information and send it up
Yeah.
to assist.
Yeah.
And the supreme being may be doing the same.
Yeah, that's a good way of
For this
thinking.
person.
It's a good way of thinking about it. And keep in mind that all those microtubules in the body feed the vagus nerve, which feeds the brainstem, which decides where all the things go for processing. Oh, that's just memory. Oh, that's just the heart. Or we got to think about this one. So it's that accumulation of activity that triggers the thought. So it may be that the accumulation of our collective activities are what's building the supreme, and then the supreme has to deal with what we do.
NASA shows those pictures from far away, and they look like nerves all over the space.
Yeah, the filaments of
The filaments, and they literally look like a nervous system.
Yeah.
And that could be the supreme being.
You have to be a little bit careful about those astronomy pictures because they have the whole big picture wrong. They don't know about the counter rotations of the outer space levels, and we're always looking at the outer space levels because we don't see the Milky Way, which is probably the 70s.
Mine is a very simple, silly
This is the
question.
S kind.
Is that,
You know, hard to-
is that a delta strap around your
No, it's called a muse. And for those that came in early, it's measuring the brain activity, and there's an app on your phone that displays that activity. So that delta, theta, gamma wavelengths are all separated by frequency, and it gives you visibility. So you can see what it takes to calm. You can see when you're in a meditative state. If you open your eyes, then you screw it up.
It's, can you use it to play a tone so you don't have to open your eyes?
I tried to get a hold of,
There are birds. Yeah.
yeah, there are birds that tell you when you reach a certain state of delta wave.
Yeah.
But I wanted to just give you a tone. You know, so that you don't know, but unfortunately that's not available. I tried to get a programmer that knows how to program these things to do that, but still, the work in process.
Would you say that my friend's question to you that came from his like pre-organized mind,
Yes.
he already knew the answer to his question? And then you affirmed back to him his own innate knowingness within the tunnels and the tubulars and the frequency and whatever.
We tend to want to reinforce what we think. That's a problem, because what we're looking for is confirmation, not education. And, you know, to the extent that my answer satiated, oh yeah, I'm right, yeah, I got it, you know, he ingrained his way of thinking to say, yeah, that's right, that's the way things should be, that's the way we think. So he's less open to, well, let's think about how that might involve other things. When he learns more things, he'll connect more of the dots to his current. But we typically want the path of least electrical resistance. So we want things to match the way we currently think. So we're making them fit. The cognitive dissonance says, well, that's wrong. But if I think about it this way, it's partly right. So that's okay, you know? So we're trying to fix things to fit our way of thinking. When you talk about healing someone in 21 days, you're trying to repattern the way they think. I know it's wrong, but if I think this way, you know. So we're constantly reprogramming our thinking.
We tell the kids when they say, why do I get brain freeze?
I'm talking about with a cold. When
No,
kids.
drinking, like eating an ice cream.
Eating an ice cream, because that part of your brain is right close to the roof of your mouth. When you have cold on the top of the mouth, it affects the brain area that's right close to the palate of the mouth.
Is that why if you rub your tongue on the roof, it takes the brain?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Chuck has got a question, then I see two more here, so let's go 1, 2, 3. No, okay.
It sounds to me like all this information is one of the premise to the father's decree that we are all sovereign over it.
Yes.
That is true.
And we are developing, discovering, like what your hand was, for a great supreme purpose.
Yeah. But you don't need to know the physics in order to do that. I was teaching you what mother's mechanisms, or some of mother's mechanisms might be in the life carrier mechanism to facilitate that free will decision.
My question is kind of practical. I was looking at the brain waves and about that interruption. When I read, whether it's to myself or out loud, my eyes are ahead of my mouth.
Yes.
And
And your brain's ahead of your mouth, yeah.
yeah,
Eyes are feeding the black dots into the brain that's interpreting it, and the brain is saying, okay, this, what we say now is representative of those black dots. Yeah, it's a whole process. And it's not just a linear process. You're not linearly processing. It's massively parallel processing across those 100 trillion synapses when those things are happening. So but you're in control of that. You can read different words if you want to.
Our God is an awesome God. Back up just a minute, Jeff, you go, oh, here, go ahead. Cheryl and then Jackie.
Question that collapse of those two buildings.
It's not the collapse of the tubules, it's the collapse of the electrical current down the tubules. That's cohering with the neighboring tubules, and when they sort of lock on, then they.
Okay, is it possible to experience that collapse with your conscious mind? Could you feel that that would be happening?
It's
Or no?
It's probably possible, but I'm not sure how you would know, because it's happening in every cell of your body.
Right,
And it's happening mostly in the brain, so it's probably in the cross-pollination of your thinking as it is aha.
okay, so.
You know, if you get that, oh yeah.
Yeah, well, why I'm asking that question is when I finally reach a state of meditation where I know that I am finally made it to the state of meditation, it feels as if there is a screen or a veil or a wall that has suddenly collapsed.
Yep.
And I can now move deeper into that state.
That's probably not happening at the microtubule level. It's probably happening in the frontal cortexes, in the delta wave, going down to theta, going down to
Okay, so
the
it's
delta
moving
wave. So
down
you're
into the wavelength.
moving down till the lower frequencies just go, or as suddenly the yoga says.
No, it's okay.
So this is back on a question about reading, and it's a teacher question. So are you sort of saying that the difference that separates a quote good reader from a bad reader is their ability to process the dots?
Yeah, well, and to stay focused on that process. Yeah, you've got to process. The photons have got to come into the eye, they got to trigger down, the peptides got to move over, they got to trigger an electrical voltage down the optic nerve that's got to go to the brain stem, that's got to go to the frontal cortex for processing, that's got to go to the reference areas of the brain to say, oh yeah, that's an A, you know, and it's pronounced like ah, and then, you know, we'll put the pieces together, oh, that's this word. Oh, move the tongue this way. It's massively complex and somewhat serial processing, but somewhat parallel processing. It happens in an instant, in a millisecond. And all that activity, remember, is happening in that 300 milliseconds before the thought of, is that an A? You know?
Michael's got a question in the back, Jim.
Yeah, Jeff, is it a similar process wherein, you know, for the optic nerve, joins the back of the retina, there's no receptors.
Mm.
So is it a similar process that the brain uses to fill that picture in?
Probably. There's, in the hippocampus, there's 1 input, 10 outputs. So if you think about the multiple rods and cones giving you multiple inputs and going to multiple areas of the brain for processing, but it's massively complex in terms of that processing. And I think we can just barely understand the relatedness of them and realize that the sum total of it is our consciousness. It's the patterning of the way things flow.
You rightly speak of the capacity of spiritual receptivity.
Yes.
That being said, we look at it from the spirit mother's, that's what we're trying.
That's what we're trying to do here, right?
So in the words themselves, then that means that maybe we have to have some type of capacitors when you speak of electricity.
Yes.
So if you, with your intent and your will, that is your choice, and maybe that helps our capacitor increase the ability for different frequencies.
Mhm.
And if you don't, then you can't, because capacitors burn out, they can only take a certain amount of hertz. So if you increase with your will and practice, then maybe your capacitors grow, and it allows for the actual physical in physics,
Yep.
electricity to carry that information from the
Yep.
spiritual surface.
Very good.
Well said. And capacitor is a function of microtubule length. Capacitor size is a function of the frequency that the capacitor resonates at. So yes, there are portions of the brain that become electrically more conductive at certain capacitance.
Let me ask you
One
a
of the things I talked about at the end is, and it's probably most appropriate to talk about it now. If you think about Michael's brain, what was he doing? He was patterning his brain. He was teaching his physiology how to deal with stress, how to deal with emotional responses, how to deal with people. So I think what the spirit of truth is looking at Jesus's brain hardware, looking at his microtubule lengths and saying, okay, if people can learn to focus like this, if they had microtubules that talked like this, they could think like mine. So if you think about the way your brain is patterning thoughts, the way reacting to inputs, the way Michael did, that's probably the truth. So you get a sense of how he would respond to a given input. And it's physical. And there's a quote, and I'll give it to you later on, that says it's a matter of fact as well as truth. The spirit of truth is a measure of fact. And this may be involving some of the facts of the spirit of truth.
I've always wondered about exchanging my mind for the mind of Jesus. It just really made me flash.
Yeah, if you can think like he thought, if you can train your brain to focus. How did he deal with the major problems? Focus. How do you focus? You bring down the cacophony of noise and make sure that the way you think is the way Jesus thinks, and do it repetitively over 21 days or 3 years or a lifetime, and become more and more like that way of thinking, that way of processing electrical inputs. Sorry, one ahead first.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how all this plays into intellectual capacity as somebody who's worked for years with persons with developmental disabilities and neurological functioning as somebody personally who has ADD. You know, how do we address those issues? And the Urantia book is a very heady book. So if we're wanting to reach other people with the Urantia book and half the population is not intellectually capable of understanding it and the language it's written in, how is that?
Yeah, well, I don't, you know, many people won't understand this. So what we need to do is to simplify it, to say, be calm, be of good cheer, have confidence in God. You don't need to know the physiology. What you need to know what the physiology needs in order for you to grow. You know, ADD is more of a think about this. Yeah. So focusing, you know, is as much important to me as it is to someone with neurological. I talk about a little later on with some of the drugs that do the psilocybin.
Karen, and then I want to talk to you. John.
I just wanted to ask about the executive functions in the brain and processing speed. How is that impacted?
By what?
Processing speed.
Yeah, what about it? That's up in the higher frequency range.
How does that impact these reactions and responses? Does that have any?
Well, it's all interconnected. So the higher intellectual functionings or the higher mental activities are very dominant in your thinking. You know, they got your attention. You have to quiet them. You have to ignore. You've got to do the pratyahara thing that says, yeah, I don't know all that's going on, but I want to focus. And then you can calm the mind and be more aware of the thought, the process of thinking, the being Jesus-like instead of being.
So a quicker processing could actually be causing you a delay. Is actually want to slower.
You want to slow it down. You want to be calm and know that it's all going to work out.
They say there's no shortcuts. John, and then we're gonna
Move on.
we'll take a break. We're gonna take a break, just a short break, so everybody can
Really?
John?
I don't want to lose them.
No, we
Michael
won't
had
lose.
to deal with the Greek thinking of the first century Roman world.
I'm sorry? What about it? What about the first century?
When Michael came here, he had to deal with the Greek thinking of the first century Roman world.
Yes.
Just a comment, I'm wondering how different his presentation would be today.
Yeah. And he was trying to, you know, work with a Jewish mentality, you know, if I'm wealthy, then God's happy with me, you know, and he was trying to turn the whole fear your enemy to love your enemy thing. He was trying to turn everything upside down. Yeah, the whole thing. I talked about that at the end. We're gonna get to the what I call a Jesus flip.
So a super quick, if you have to, must, need, leave, and this is a good time, we will not be offended and all that, this would be the time.
So now we're gonna look for those alignments, but think about this. The nuclei of every molecule in your body, mostly the water molecules, but you're 99% water, align with magnets, right? They can be aligned strongly in a strong magnetic field, but when you're out in Earth's magnetic field, you're aligned to Earth's magnetic field. What's paradise? The source of those magnetic fields. So technically, you have a magnetic orientation to paradise in every cell in your body. Some cells, homing pigeons and things have specific areas of cells which are more fluid and can be more like the needle on your compass that float around, but we still have that ability to sense paradise. Anyway, there are multiple levels of coherence in the brain. They also found a 300 to 400 millisecond delay between those coherences and the blood flow that was supplying those areas in the brain. So there's a delay in that coherence. In other words, they're communicating, in sync. It's like an orchestrated thing. So again, there's time to process the input and the reaction to the input, even in the brain itself, not just in the microtubules, but in the nerves and neurons and synapses that are reacting. We also find the same thing in magnetoencephalography, MEG, where they do the same thing with individual probes with what they call SQUIDs, superconducting quantum interference devices, and SERFs, spin exchange relaxation free detectors. But these are just detectors that detect localized magnetic fields, and they're also seeing those quantum coherences at that level. When we think of quantum coherence, when we're trying to say, how does the thought adjuster, that's a purely spiritual entity, interact with something that's so vibrationally, electrochemically driven? Because they don't speak the same language. They're up here in the whatever frequency, and we're down here in the, in the mud. So we've got to think about how do those hugely disparate energy ranges interact? And it's probably happening in the area of coherence, where the part is sensing the influence of the whole. So that's where we're trying to go with this, and we're going to look for other ways to do that. One of the ways that we can change this whole thing is something that's called ARCs and THAMs. ARCs are activity-regulated cytoskeletal peptides. So connecting the cells, the cytoskeleton is the skeleton that connects the cells. You've got an mRNA-like process. mRNA-like process is it's sharing a portion, an RNA portion, with its neighbors for the spread of information. So it builds the pathways, it builds your memories, it builds the way you react. And it builds them constantly with this process, or using one of these processes. And when you think it often and you think it consistently, you build those ways of thinking, or your accent, or your mannerisms. And it's glued together in that pattern using these peptide beads called SAMs. So it's looking for the lowest energy state. We're basically lazy. So it's trying to use what energy it has in the most efficient manner. And you can define what that manner is. So we talk about this mRNA process, but basically it's exchanging information between the synapses for specific functions, like putting the pieces together. Putting Aunt Mary's face together with Aunt Mary's dress that she usually wears, that kind of thing. It's all physics. And this is done differentially in the different areas of the brain. So if you look at the frontal area of the brain, it's involuntary motion, short-term memory task, motivation, planning and speech. You look at the parietal lobe, it's proprioception, it's mechanical perception, what you're doing, what you're touching, what you're involved with mechanically. And language processing, it's when you read, it has to go to a different part of the brain for interpreting than for speaking. The temporal lobe, it's looking at derived meanings, visual memory, that something. The occipital lobe for taste and pain and vestibular functions. The limbic lobe, very much controlled in your emotions and modulation of the autonomic functions, learning and memory. But really, let's look at the areas of the brain that the thought adjuster is most likely involved. Most likely he's involved with these areas that I've done in bold. And he's working with those situations which involve this intellectual and testing social situations, and those are likely these kinds of brain lobe involvements. But look at the frequencies they act at. The frontal lobe, 20 hertz, 20 to 23 hertz. The temporal lobe, where all the other stuff happens in two areas, the middle and inferior, one in the back. Derived meanings. This is probably where the thought adjuster is most involved in. And the frequencies that they're acting at are down in the 20 hertz range. You gotta be calm. You can't be frenetic if you're going to be aware of where the thought adjuster is trying to influence you. You can't be distracted. Can't be, watching a ball game and excited about that hit when they pass at the last inning, A really interesting portion of the brain is the locus coeruleus. It's called the blue spot of the brain, but it's the critical in the response to stress and attention to detail, emotion, motivation, decision-making, learning, and memory. And this nephrine system is your time-sensitive system. It also is amplitude-sensitive, so the more excited you are, this is the area of the brain that's involved in that. But it likely has that ability to be time sensitive so that you can be aware of the thought, the consequences of the thought, and your reaction to the consequences of that thought. So if we can change the time delay, if we can give the thought adjuster time between the sensory input and our response to it, to be involved in that thought precursor phase, it's probably happening everywhere, but we're probably most aware of it in this. And this is where the child mind comes in, because the child hasn't pre-thought all these thoughts. They're still trying to put things in place and in patterns. Yeah. Come in with an open mind. So our consciousness then becomes a feedback loop between the way the brain is structured, the input to the way the brain is structured, our realization of the way the brain is reacting to that structure, and then the consequences of that reaction. So we have this time to process the thought, reaction to the thought, and the the choice of what we do with that, or how we can be spiritually guided in that thought loop. We're the only animal species that has that time between sensory input and response. If you immediately react to your sensory input, you're either in the fight or flight mode or you're in contemplative mode. So one of the places where this whole process is most apparent is in the near-death experience. You have Byron here, but in a near-death experience, there's often associated with that spiritual uplifting. If you come out of a near-death experience, very spiritually involved. What do you think? What is happening physiologically that would trigger that? And it could be that as the blood flow drops, the oxygen levels that generate the battery, that charge the battery, that discharge the battery, also drop. So that 70 millivolt base drops, and that 30 microvolt voltage on top of that 70 millivolt base becomes more dominant. And there's probably a cascade then across all these channels of thinking that we've developed. We've focused our thinking. This is the way I think. This is the way I speak. This is the way I act. This is the way I do things. And as we lose that, there's this massive cross-pollination of thinking. There's a family of drugs called the tryptamines, this echinacea, psilocybin, and DMT, that are called the spirit molecules. Why are they called that? Well, because that's exactly what they do. They massively cross-pollinate all the thoughts. They get away with the troughs. They lower the base voltage level and give you this massive cross-pollination. What does the Urantia book say? Thought adjuster's hanging in there to the last minute. Why? Because he gets one last kick at the cat. I'm not recommending those drugs. If we can do it without any drugs, we're better off. Emotional involvement. Emotions are getting controlled by peptides, those small segments of proteins, which, remember, are modifiable in our epigenetic modification processes, which control the way we think, and we can control the way we act, but we're doing it by managing our peptides. You gotta have a peptides, your proteins available, treat the temple well, balanced neural networks, etc. But the emotional response determines the time between that anticipatory or that sensory input and our response to it. If you let your emotions run your life, then you're just animal. You're just responding to that sensory input. If you can not let the emotions take over, because your emotions are all pre-canned ways of thinking, right? And basically what those emotions are little packets of these neural peptide at the end of each neural segment. Sensor comes in, goes down the nerve, gets to the synapse. It says, oh, this is high frequency, long duration. I better put adrenaline in, and it releases adrenaline from the synapse, and that triggers the next nerve that says, oh shit, we got adrenaline going on, we got do something here. So you determine what peptides are released or what neurotransmitters are released at each of those synapses by the way you react to a given situation. And if we have this faith, trust in the gracious and acceptable plan of God, we don't let the emotions overwhelm us in that process. But let's look at some of the mechanics here. In the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we've got the decision making. It's called a default mode network. This is the way you're rewired. you're hardwired by this. You can still change your hardwiring. It takes time, it takes focus, it takes act. How long would it take you to change your accent? You know, you can work on it. You can, actors can develop a British accent, but they gotta work at it. It's the same way when you're trying to develop different ways of thinking. And the thought adjusters work, you know, patient, and dealing with that time process. Superconscious network. It's the way you are currently wired. You got to work to change that. It's activated during resting, sleep, meditation, that hypnagogia, that state where you're just going in. That's probably the most creative part. So pay attention to what's going on in that collapse into state, into sleep. It's self-referential. So it's thinking about how you're influencing yourself. It involves moral reasoning, recollection, and imaging the future, where you're going to be. So I think of the adjunct mind, cosmic mind, as filters. The infinite mind is infinite, right? So what does it do with us animals? Well, it has to sort of dumb it down for us. And quite frankly, it keeps it at the survival. It just filters out the bit they're gonna need to survive. Right? Don't worry about the cosmic thinking, just survive. And when we get to the Morancha state of thinking, and you guys are probably all at the Morancha state of thinking, we're thinking much more about our connectedness, our cosmic thinking. How do we relate to the whole? How do we relate to God? That's probably just a less filter. We're not as worried about survival, but we're now worried about the survival of the family, race, tribe, nation, globe, cosmos. So we're just getting a bigger and bigger opening on the filter of how they can influence our thinking. So this part of the brain is what does the prioritization. All right. So we have this whole prefrontal cortex can be an experience simulator. We can build the picture in our mind of where we are, where we're going, and what our involvement in God's plan would be and what our potential contribution is. So we're always building maps, putting them in a timeline, putting our persona in that map, and developing the picture. So we're trying to bridle our passions, harness our energies, and involve ourselves and be patient in the majestic evolving evolution of progressive career. So progressive thinking, or the thinking process. We always hear people thinking about right brain, left brain, male, female like thinking. You know, some call it a linear male thinking process versus a female evolution thought. But I like to think of thinking as a volume, a three-dimensional volume, where we've got clouds of things that are interactive and associative. So you don't think thoughts, think interactions of all thoughts. Go back to the childlike mind that was trying to put the pieces together. Don't assume you've got all the pieces together. In the effortless attention of worship, best place for it, low frequency. Let the thought adjuster do the work. So what we're looking for are cosmic levels of emotional equipoise, calmness, equanimity. How can we be happy with where we are? It's involved in that time-delayed response to those animal inputs. It's like like injecting an infinite small part of infinity into our temporality. Right? Slowing us down. It's buying us that time to think. It's buying us the time to be aware. What are we aware of? Well, curiosity, aesthetic appreciation, ethic sensitivity. We're paying attention. We're taking the time to pay attention to how these things are happening. The calmness associated with being in beautiful surroundings. You know, listening to that beautiful cello. It's that kind of calmness. Now take that and broaden it out to a cosmic perspective. Attach yourself, put yourself in that map of the cosmos. Relate to paradise, which by the way is stationary. Can you imagine the calmness of Andon and Fonda when they first discovered how that they can now have fire? You know, they're always worried about having fire. Now they got the ability to do it anywhere. It's like, wow.
As long as they have a bird's nest.
But there's lots of those birds.
Still birds, lots of birds.
Anyway, that's the kind of thing I'm trying to say here is that level worked for them, a different level of that calmness will work for you. If we think about sentience and God consciousness, you know, during this evolutionary process, we've got the adjunants, you know, intuition, understanding, courage, knowledge, all of those things are involved in those microtubules that connect all of the cells. They're in those neurotransmitters. They're in the patterning of those in your mind and your body that first of all function to have you survive, right? And then when you get up to worship and wisdom, they connect you to your future. But it's all physics. It's not woo-woo. It's not magic. It's real microtubule assisted proteins connecting the microtubules in the brain, and they have to be at the certain stage, have to be longer than a nanometer, up to 50 nanometers in length. They have to be electrically isolated. They have to be stacked just right. They have to be not hot. If you have a fever, they shut down. Why is it that when you're sick, you don't think spiritually? You think God's deserted you. You know, you're sick. You know, it's like, yeah, it's because your microtubules aren't working. Anytime you're hot or noisy, your microtubules can't communicate. It's the reason they say this orchestrated reduction, this OOR, won't work is because they say it's already too noisy and hot for it to function. But I think science is going to continue to affirm. This came out in 1990, and it's becoming more and more solidified as they search for what consciousness is. And consciousness, of course, is very closely related to mind. What's mind? So they're zeroing in on this microtubules or this quantum coherence of microtubules as the reality of consciousness. Has to be greater than 10 to the minus 6 meters in length to function.
Here is waving
Oh,
in
sorry.
the corner.
Yeah, question, Jeff, up there at that paragraph, it talks about the associated time delays.
Yeah.
Is that similar to the time delays you were talking earlier between expectation and then the experience and that delay between them?
Yes, and what gives you that time delay? It's the length of those microtubules. And the patterning of the lengths of those microtubules.
And I was wondering in terms of in spiritual practice, we work to be non-judgmental, which would seemingly have us have less expectations of what happens or in that time delay process. If there's less expectation, there's almost more space for that time delay for guidance to draw it in there.
Yeah. Yeah, anytime you have an emotional response, it sort of short circuits the works. if your emotions are triggering the neurons, or triggering the synapses, or triggering the neurotransmitters, you're short-circuiting. You want to be aware of what the body is telling you. That gut feeling, 95% of your serotonin comes from the gut. Most of this intercellular cytoskeletal structure, the microtubules, is in all the cells of your body have a DNA. A lot of that's in your brain. That's how you post-process this stuff. But the thing that will give you that time delay is the length of those microtubules, up to a half a second between that sensory input. But you can short circuit it. You can, your emotional reaction to it or your preconceived notion can just take over. But if you want to be aware of how this thought adjuster is trying to communicate to you, you got to listen in that half second, that 500 millisecond. You got to think like Jesus did. And what did he do? He focused on whatever problem he was trying to serve.
We got one more quick question, Jeffrey.
Sure.
In the quote there it says, in the moral experience of human intellect resides the rhythmic pulsation. And it is literally telling me, as I read it, that there is a ministry being broadcast. It's an actual channel, like a radio channel, and it has an actual frequency. That's what a rhythmic pulsation is, a frequency. And then you choose to attune to it, then you're gonna be in that arena. You will be able to receive, and maybe this is where we need to go, where to find that fine tuning, to turn that channel. You need to quiet the mind to actually be able to, and then you will receive, just listen, receive that tuning.
Yeah.
You tap into it.
Yeah, we don't really do the tuning. All we can do is quiet the background noise. So the signal strength is there. We just don't hear it above the rest of the noise. And it's probably happening at some subharmonic of the spiritual frequency. So we're really, trying to tune something that's out of our tuning range.
Yes?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you said this before or not, and maybe mistake. Is there a way to increase this length of the microtubules? And how do I know how long?
If there was a magic pill you could just take to say, here, lengthen my telomeres or lengthen my microtubules, yeah. I don't know of a specific way, but what I'm trying to suggest here is that we can lengthen the microtubules by lengthening the time. When we're learning a new process, when we're trying to learn to speak Italian, it takes time. And if we're trying to calm the environment, if we're trying to lengthen the time between stimulus and response to that stimulus, we have to be calm in that, don't jump to conclusions, So you're trying to lengthen. How do we do that? By having the mind of Christ, by thinking the way he thought. Because he's given us the pattern of how our microtubules should be organized, how our brain thinking should be organized. This is the way we should think. This is how we should think. So if you're asking me, is there a way? I would say studying the life of Christ is probably the best way to grow your microtubules. Because if you're trying to grow some different pattern, it's not going to work. So
Jeff, I'm jumping in. It's 12:05. We have 10 minutes. I know you want to get to your summary and your closing. We're going to let Jeff roll if you're okay. And try to meet the 12:15. And yes, that's all I'll say.
Okay, yeah, good. Thank you. Anyway, what Jesus was trying to get us to do was to turn the world upside down. He was trying to get us to go from animal survivalist to cosmic thinking. I call it the Jesus flip. We were afraid of everybody. Now he wants us to love our enemies. Yes. Do good to those that hate you. Bless those who curse you. So he's turning everything on end. He's teaching us to be godlike, right? And that means everything. And that involves the physical as well. What's fusion when your thought adjuster fuses? Well, it's probably where your mental activity matches the thought adjuster's mental activity. In nuclear fusion occurs when two things get close enough that the nuclear force takes over and all that excess energy is dissipated. That's what nuclear fusion is. that probably happens in our case where where our thinking patterns match thought adjuster thinking patterns close enough to discard the rest of the unnecessary energy in chariots of fire. Yes. So this is a picture of brain activity, and you can see it's zones of thinking, and that's in three dimensions, or 4 dimensions, really. Soul physiology. How do we make the transition to the mansion worlds? How do they recreate us? Well, it may be that the 800 or 80 trillion cells in our body, with our DNA, base DNA, and remember that epigenetic modification? And remember those synaptic or those brain patterns, the microtubule lengths and how their brains, those are all mathematical. They're all physical. Those are just numbers. Your physical patterning can be reduced to DNA numbers, epigenetic tagging, and some other modifications. That number can be relayed to mansion world number 1, while your guardian angels in transit. So they can have a body based on your material DNA and current thinking, current memories, just the patterns of the way you deal with things, in a form ready for you to awaken and take up there right where you left off here. So, in summary, we've got microtubule lengths. We've got microtubule-assisted proteins which connect those microtubules. We've got ARCs and SAMs and those 4,000 DNA enhancers that are unique to us. Multiple types of epigenetic modification that you control. We've got the the HBA axis, the timekeeper. We've got lots of coherences, electromagnetic and magnetic, optical coherences in each of those microtubules. We've got consciousness of our consciousness. We've got a creative picturization. We can build those pictures that work best for us. We've got this worshipful, meditative calmness, this calmness of being part of God's plan. All of those are at your disposal. Here's some take-home points. Your body supports your mind. It's the temple. So give it the right proteins, give it the right exercise, give it the right BMI. Your attitudes, your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, they change on a moment by moment basis and influence your spiritual receptivity. Be slow. Take advantage of that time delay and be open to reflective change. Think about the cross-pollination. Be childlike in your faith and trust in God, but adult in your focus. Creatively leap from the stable, calm confidence in God's plan. For where your thoughts go, energy flows. The brain will organize it the way you want it to be organized. Your emotions make epigenetic modifications to your dream expression. So if you want to be a nervous, anxious, angry person, go for it. You have control on an instant by instant basis. Align your anticipations with the top-down, love your enemy perspective, because that's the one that fits for the long term. Survival of the self, the individual, only works in the material phase. You're going to make the transition, you got to align the bigger picture. There's an interesting concept I'm working on for the next iteration of this, and that's information sorting after heat death. When the entropy of your body goes to dust, the soul continues to find pattern. And the death of a black hole is still information processing even after heat death of the black hole. Hawking radiation. Anyway, and I'm trying to tie that to our death, similar We're trying to pattern things during life. That attempt to patterning carries on after death. And now we know that it's easy to recreate us with a bunch of numbers on a mansion line. And the thought adjuster will come back with our memories. We've already got a brain capable of receiving those memories and we're capable of processing the way we would be processed on Earth, because they've got our epigenetic patterning, our methylation and our DNA and our current biases. Let paradise be your stable, stationary time reference. You need a time reference. You need to orient this map, where am I, to paradise. And you need a time reference to say, okay, it's going to take some time to get there. I'm working at 4 hertz. At 4 hertz, it's going to take billions. Let your thought adjuster be the stable short term for your material motion. Invert your consequential thinking to those of Jesus. The think like God process. Stay cool, calm, and collected because your microtubules don't work if they're hot and noisy. Get good sleep and worship often, because that's where the delta wave dominates. That's where your thought adjuster can do his best work. And by the way, where your theta wave time reference is strongest is when you're in sleep. And I guess it doesn't want me
No.
to do the last.
It does. Go ahead, bring it up.
It'll come up by itself. How much time do we have for any questions, or do we?
We don't.
Okay, we don't?
Say a couple of things and you finish up your written list and yeah.
Well, it's just, I changed Descartes' famous saying, I think before, therefore I am, to my thoughts improve my electrochemical responses, therefore I am. And I will be.
Wait 1 second. So here, he skipped 14 and we cannot. Still, and know that mother's processes guiding us to find father are unfolding as they should. We can't get.
Mother's good at what she does. She's an engineer, Yeah, I've got a few copies of the hardware, but it was available as a download, and if you give me your email address, I'll send you it, or you
So
can
tell
go to
them your email and your website.
my email. Well, I got it on my website, and I'll keep updating it with the latest ones. It's ubjeff, GEOFF.com. ubjeff.com.
But it is, the link is in our program.
The link is in your program.
We download that, then if we have this.
If it's a digital version of the program, it will download from there. An older version, but still.
Copy, so those of you who must have one now, you may, and I do have a closing quote. Or this one, yeah, I really want one. And please take these, they're beautiful, they're absolutely beautiful.
Here's closing.
So let.
I just put it in that, and.